Thank you very much for attending our breakout session on environmental monitoring, air, land, and water. Hopefully, we've assembled quite a large panel. I think it may be the largest breakout panel of the summit. But my name's Matt Burgess, and I'm the moderator for this panel. And rather than me introduce each of our panelists, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to each of them one at a time to tell you a little bit about themselves, their experience, what they primarily work on, and then some of their drone usage and current projects and potential projects that they're looking at. And then once we do that, I'm going to ask a couple real simple questions, but I really want to turn this over to you so that you can ask us questions, okay? So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Kimberly.
All right, thank you all for coming. I'm Kimberly Andrews. I'm faculty at the Odum School of Ecology, and my lab is housed on the coast. We're out of the Marine Extension in Brunswick. And so we research various coastal issues. We do a lot of wildlife biology by training. I'm a herpetologist, but we've expanded into more issues, particularly as these coastal issues and systems and impacts become more complex. We look a lot at habitat change, natural habitat change. Climate change is naturally becoming a substantial issue in storms. But we also look at impacts of development, development resiliency, and naturally along a lot of shorelines. So where do we have these pinch points between rising waters and wildlife needing to use edges, but us needing to use features like causeways for our social needs as well. So we're pretty new to the drone field. We're looking at using them for basic applications such as wildlife counts. Daniel Harris actually was involved with one of my former graduate students flying drones over creeks to see if we can count diamondback terrapins in a more time efficient and less invasive way. They tend to scurry with big humans and boats going through the waters when you're trying to count them. And then we also have several projects both in Georgia and in Costa Rica trying to see how can we use drones to more accurately monitor the shoreline changes, erosion rates, and then tidal inundation. So aside from the graduate students, we're also looking at some education capacity. Dr. Marguerite Madden and I are actually looking at having a Maymester at Wormslow and starting to incorporate training for students and applying these for their not just ecological research, but also some of these planning needs that are really growing intensely along the coast. So being new to the field, I think I can best represent some of the needs for these applications. And yeah, again, thank you all for coming. This is a great network.
Hi, I'm Marguerite Madden. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography here at UGA and the director of the Center for Geospatial Research, which is also in geography. And I'd like to introduce our associate director here, Dr. Sergio Bernardez. He's here too. We've worked with aerial photographs and satellite data, done remote sensing, and used a lot of GIS and geospatial techniques for a long time. My background's in ecology, but I've always worked in geography departments. And a few years ago, when the first DJI Phantom 2, our purchase of that, Dr. Tommy Jordan, who was the associate director at the time, he bought one, and we just got so excited because we've been looking at the landscape from above, but never just above the treetops that are up to 400 feet. So just an awesome resource, and the flexibility of being able to fly when you need to, as often as you want to, and the way you want to is just incredible. We spent a lot of money on helicopters flying over the Everglades. We did vegetation mapping, and they're super expensive. And so this was cost effective and just real exciting, a lot of fun. So we have a number of graduate students who are incorporating this into their research, tried to put it into my classes. a little bit, well, about the ethics and the laws, and not really how to fly, but we try to demonstrate that. But also the image processing. So what do you do with the images that you capture? And one exciting photogrammetric process is called structure from motion. So you can take stills out of the videos or fly purposefully from different perspectives, different angles, and there's software available to create 3D point models, drape the images on top, look at volume changes and structure, shoreline change, vegetation, agricultural applications, cultural resources. We have one student who's looking at landmine detection. So just, your imagination is the limit just about. So we're on our maybe 4th DGI, maybe something like that. We're trying some different sensors. Sergio has recently gotten a microsense, which is a 5-band sensor. It's just an exciting time, I think. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jeff Beauvais. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Integrative Conservation and Ecology program in Jeb Byers' lab. I study the ecological impacts of coastal development and how race-based real estate practices have fueled development of the coast and loss of African American land in the coast. I mainly use, I'm a very, very new member to the UAS committee or world. I use it mainly to look at bare patches in the marsh because I'm interested in how genetic diversity within the dominant plant species, Spartina, imparts resilience and resistance to global change such as sea level rise and heating. So I basically use it to find open patches in the marsh and to also quantify how these masses of dead floating stems, which smother and kill living vegetation, are being changed by the presence of coastal structures like docks, seawalls, jetties, riprap, things like that. So that's basically what I use it for.
Hi, I'm Daniel Harris. I'm also a PhD student in the Byers Lab at the Odum School of Ecology. I study oysters and Spartina marsh grass. Both species are really effective at erosion control and also are a first line of defense for a lot of the hurricanes and storms that we've been getting recently. So understanding where these species are, why they're there, and what might change their distribution in the future, such as climate change and sea level rise. These are the sort of questions that I'm asking. And what that means is that I go out into the marsh to areas where I can sink up to my waist in mud, and there's oysters that are laced with flesh-eating bacteria sometimes, so it's just a wonderful environment to work in. So what I like to do, as much as possible, is what I call armchair ecology, where you can sit in a chair and set a drone up and go to places that ordinarily would be really difficult to get to. But I have one of the very basic DGI, I guess Vision Plus 2s, and for a grad student, obviously I can't afford anything more fancy than that, but for my needs, for getting to some of these areas, it's been really, really useful. So yeah, that's pretty much everything.
Hi everyone, I'm Courtney Balling. I'm a second-year master's student in the Department of Crop and Soil Science at UGA. I work largely with the Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grants, studying erosion rates in tidal creeks on the coast. I'm specifically interested in the impacts of different shoreline hardening structures on tidal creeks, mostly on adjacent properties. So we're comparing the effects of hardened structures like bulkheads or seawalls to what are called living shorelines, which is still a man-made structure but composed of native marsh grasses and oyster reefs, still used for erosion control, but that aims to mimic our natural marsh ecosystem. So we're looking at how those two structures impact adjacent properties, because there's been some evidence that hardened structures can transfer wave energy to the properties adjacent to them, causing a domino effect where one landowner puts in a hardened structure, then their neighbor has to do the same, then their neighbor has to do the same, and so it goes until we have a much more hardened coast than maybe we would like. And so we're interested in how living shorelines will behave differently. I'm using drone imagery, the structure for motion technique that Dr. Madden mentioned, to create 3D models of tidal creeks so that we can compare volume losses and gains at an extremely high resolution that I have never been able to do before. My background is in soil science, and the only tool that I had to measure erosion rates previously was, if any of you are familiar with erosion pins, it's just a pin that you put in the side of a stream bank and you measure how much is sticking out. And then you come back later and you measure it again. And the resolution is really low, and like Daniel mentioned, it would involve me sinking up to my waist in the marsh for days at a time at each site. And instead, Dr. Madden and Tommy Jordan have so graciously offered their drone services to fly these sites, and we can get a site flown in half an hour where it may have taken me days to get much lower resolution data. So it's a huge leap forward in terms of the resolution we can detect in changes in the creeks.
Thanks. And again, I'm Matt Burgess. I'm a PhD, just recently finished my PhD from the University of Florida. I've been working in unmanned aircraft systems for natural resources for the last 10 years. So I've been actually pretty fortunate. I've had the chance to watch this grow from a primarily military-only tool to where we are today, having meetings and sessions on using these things for natural resource applications and things. I do a lot of work consulting with various agencies, providing information. I actually came and spoke here to the University of Georgia about 3 years ago to discuss some of the emerging things that were coming out of UAS work, and it's quite impressive to see the changes that have happened in just that 3-year period. I'm traditionally educated as an ecologist, a fisheries biologist, but I've always had a knack for technology. I raced RC cars competitively and never thought that was going to appear on my CV, but it did in order to get me as the program coordinator for the UAS research program. That program started in 1999 and basically has always had a natural resource application focus. So one of the first things we were doing was strapping just a point-and-shoot camera on the bottom of a hobby model that you had to order out of a catalog at the time, and it took 2 weeks to get to you. And we were flying over the Everglades looking for alligator nests, as opposed to teams of helicopters trying to direct folks in airboats at low altitudes. It was just a real mess. Anyway, we've done a lot of work, our program has, in the 18 years, and during my last 10 years, I've really had the opportunity to explore a lot of different things from the environmental sense. Our panel consists of a lot of wetland-oriented folks. You can kind of sense that. I obviously have a lot of wetlands knowledge as well. Working in the southeast U.S., we have quite a few wetlands. But I also have experience working in Idaho, pygmy rabbits. I've done some work for the Navy at Patuxent Naval Air Station, and I've also got some experience working in air sampling, as well as worked with NOAA and the Marine Mammal Group. Some of you may have seen the SnotBot stuff yesterday. I was on a team that helped organize how that was going to be designed and stuff. So I've had some experience, and hopefully we can get some of your questions answered here today and get you thinking about some ways that UAS drones might be of assistance to you in whatever it is that you might be doing. Like I said, I'll go ahead and open it with a pretty simple question to kind of get things going, and then I'd really like to turn it over to you to ask questions. So for our panelists here, in your opinion, what do you think the next big thing for unmanned aircraft systems, drones, will be for environmental monitoring applications? At this conference, we've seen some examples of their use, but thinking specifically about some of the things that you're working on, what do you think might be the next step? And I'll just open it up and see if anybody.
Just one idea.
Yeah, go for it.
It's well, multi-sensors. That's why we say UAS, because it's a system, not just a vehicle. So hopefully everything is going to get smaller and lighter, and we can put more of them on drones. If we can up our battery life and have drones that can carry these multiple sensors, I think that would be awesome. Have small LiDAR devices, hyperspectral sensors, and higher resolution cameras. We just love the detail.
Excellent. Anybody else want to comment? Yeah, go ahead. Speak in the mic. Thanks.
Something that I'd love to see, and it's probably a little ways off, but for water quality monitoring, it seems, people go around in boats sticking sensors into the water to record water quality. It's very time consuming, and if we could have a drone go to a set of waypoints and do that, that would be really, really nice.
I'll interrupt you and say it exists, and I will
Awesome.
put you in touch with someone who's doing just that. But it is excellent. I mean, excellent. Anybody else? No?
This is kind of playing off of what Marguerite was saying, but in doing a lot of wildlife spatial ecology, there's now VHF or other sort of devices that you could attach to drones. And I mean, we're always going to have to put our eyes on animals if there's certain behavioral information that maybe we need to be there to gather. But that not only would facilitate time, but it means that you don't have to be present right there with the animal. A drone flying above is probably less likely to disturb the animal. You run less of a risk of forcing movement, and even with some of where you could put multiple things on, you could then take a picture that would allow you to capture some of that behavior information. And some of these habitats we're moving through, like the dunes, for instance, we have to be really careful that as part of the process of going to that animal, that we're not also disturbing really sensitive habitat.
So quieter drones too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, those are some great answers and some obvious concerns that as environmental professionals or folks who are using these tools to help either augment existing methods of doing business or coming up with new methods to do this. These are the types of things we have to think about in order to be mindful of what we're doing that might disturb the things that we're trying to study. So now I'm just going to open it up to you with questions. I have others that I can ask, but I'll go ahead and go ahead. So go ahead.
Yes, a recurring theme from yesterday's agriculture and forestry session was that drones and aerial imagery in general by itself is not really enough to make an economic impact on growers. until the drone is able to come in and actually turn over the leaf and inspect the underside of it or sample the soil and the plant to provide ground truthing, then aerial imagery is just going to be an affirmation tool for the farmer and not really have a huge impact. And also, they're able to make the same decisions with 25 centimeter per pixel resolution from regular aerial photography that they would get from the 2 centimeter per pixel by spending days hammering on a crop with an Inspire drone. So do you really see a compelling use case, or for private industry to have a compelling business case for drone services to actually replace the traditional imaging and having boots on the ground turning over leaves?
Okay.
Sampling soil?
I'm just going to repeat the question in case anybody didn't hear. The question is there a compelling case to use drones over other sensor methods for certain things, especially when ground truthing and resolution and these sorts of things are factors that need to be accounted for? And so I'll defer here. Go ahead. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, so it's, as they said yesterday, it's totally context dependent, you know, what your needs are. I think for us, the imagery that exists right now that was flown at low tide, I think 4 years ago by the DNR for the entire coastal counties of Georgia, is really useful, but I can't see oysters in it. I can see a rough approximation where they are, but I can't see it. And if there's an event such as a hurricane, I can't see the before and after. Whereas with the drone, obviously I can. And we're on a grad student's budget as well, which is amazing. So yeah, that's a huge advantage, but a drone will never replace, as an ecologist, having to go out and boots on the ground as well. It's just an extra tool, and having that bird's eye view and really detailed bird's eye view and the ability to build 3D models with it as well is just a total game changer.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Yeah, I will second Daniel's point that there is, you know, in my work, I go out and I'm able, with really high temporal resolution, which is the real benefit of the drone for me, because these salt marsh plants grow back so quickly that, you know, I can't use DNR's data sets to do anything really meaningful because they fly every 4 or 6 years. So I can go out, you know, and monitor the same area and track regrowth. And of course, you know, I do genetic work on the plants, so I have to go out on the ground and take clippings and things. But it is very useful in, one, identifying areas, and 2, tracking the changes with really high temporal resolution.
I think it's just important, I'll just interject here, that that's a very critical piece of the puzzle that we found in doing this type of work, is to really define the question it is that you're trying to answer at the front end. So knowing whether 25 centimeter imagery versus 2.5 centimeter imagery is something you need to determine early in the process to select the correct sensor to do the work that you're going. I think the bottom line here is one size doesn't fit all, both for sensor and for aircraft platform. So for, you know, if you're looking at a large forest stand, you probably don't need 2.7 or 2.5 centimeter resolution. If you're looking at macro vegetation classifications in swamps or the nearshore coastal areas, you want to delineate Spartina from Juncus, you can probably get away with some of these things. It really just depends on the question that you're asking, and you're going to probably hear that a bunch.
Just a real quick thing. I think aside from the quality of the data, and even if we were to be able to get everything we needed from drones and turn over that leaf, I think we also need to protect the integrity of the scientist and scientific development. And I think no matter how far our technology goes, we're going to have the need as scientists to get out in the field. And I think that's, to me, retaining the naturalist part of the ecologist. There is a gestalt that we develop. There's new questions we ask that may strike us from the intimacy of turning over that leaf ourselves that I just personally don't think we'll ever get from any imagery, no matter how great it gets.
There was a question here, yeah.
Well, I guess it's also related to how many questions you may have based on the data set that you're acquiring. You may start with one idea and you may have one goal, and then you acquire the data. But it turns out, if you're a company, you may think that that product is the final product, what you're going to be delivering, and the final resolution you have. You're going to be using it just once, you're going to sell it, and that's it. In academia, you acquire the data, and you're trying to solve a problem. You have the initial original question, and then you think in the process of analyzing that data set, other questions may come up, and then if you have a better product, a higher resolution, you need the spectral resolution and the spatial resolution that could help you solve all the problems that you didn't even know that if they existed when you first planned the flight. And there's this weird feeling after you fly that perhaps that data set is not going to be able to solve or to answer all the questions, and you just cannot go back again in time and fly again because that event doesn't exist. It's not there anymore when you need to fly.
Yeah, I think that's an outstanding statement. Did everyone hear what he had to say in the back, or do I need to repeat it? I think the bottom line was that he was saying that, you know, you may have one goal in mind, but generally in science and academia both, one thing kind of leads to another, and these things tend to emerge. So, you know, how good is good enough? There's never good enough. You can always go better, you know, but at some point you have to kind of draw that line. And so I think that that's an excellent point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Yes, sir.
You mentioned briefly about using drones to test water quality upstream, downstream. Could you
Sure.
elaborate a little bit on that?
Certainly, certainly.
Best practices?
Yeah. So this has been an issue that's been, you know, thought about for a very long time, and certainly water quality, water, you know, chemistry, composition, the turbidity, whatever it might be. These things are typically very time-intensive operations. You know, normally, you know, a biologist will set out in a small John boat or something. They got to launch it into this water. They got to go sample it. It can take time to do this, and then you've got to pull the boat after you get your sample. You got to clean the boat. You got to, you know, disinfect it, if you will, put it in the next pond, and do this. Anyway, a good case study, one of my colleagues at the University of Nebraska was doing some work on this, and, you know, it would take him all day to do 8, you know, parallel retention ponds that he needed to get various water quality stuff. He designed a system there where it basically had a small quadcopter that dropped a piece of aquarium tubing, if you will, very long, obviously, but not too long. I think it was about 20 feet, and had a pump system that would pump water up from the lake into a little vial that was on a cartridge system, and it would fill an individual vial, and then he would fly the thing, after collecting the sample, over the bank. It would run a freshwater cleansing for the hose. The cartridge would rotate. He would then fly it over the next, fill next, boom, boom, boom. He could do the whole 8 ponds in a little over 70 minutes, in a thing that would normally have taken 8 hours. So again, here's an opportunity for what he was doing where he needed to collect water samples. Now, if you need to do SECI or, you know, something where you needed to look at turbidity, there's other things out there. And I know that some folks are working, for example, in some of the larger river systems at looking at things. The biggest problem, of course, in flying with 107, of course, is the 1 mile line of sight. And if you want to cover a large river or large stretches of river, certainly with rotary craft, that's difficult. It requires a lot of takeoffs and landings, or, you know, these sorts of things. So getting a waiver to allow you to have a moving ground station to potentially go down the river with this, that's a much more feasible option. It requires more legwork, but these are the types of things that are going on. Did that answer your question? There's certainly more that we can share about, but, there's a lot of things that water quality, it's a big industry, obviously, and. Okay, go ahead.
Excuse me. What do you see as the future relationship between crop dusting and drones and what that is going to be on precision agriculture in our future?
Question was on precision agriculture, specifically on pesticide and these sorts of applications in UAS. I'll open up to the panel.
Actually, probably Dr. Bernardez might want to address this too. He's working directly with some agricultural research. But, all of our work has to do with monitoring, the environment, landscapes, vegetation health, things like that. So it seems like with crop dusting, that's an issue of off-site effects. Certainly combining it with precision agriculture is really interesting. So you can have the tractors out there with very accurate GPS locations and monitors of their own sensors. They're collecting data and then associating that with the imagery that you're flying from drones. So a lot of data integration is very possible too. I know Dr. Bernardez is working with sunflower growth in California, so I don't know, with precision agriculture.
Exactly. Applying multiple sensors. In that case, it's not exactly applying herbicides or pesticides, but using the drones to collect data from this field that has many genotypes of sunflower and multiple treatments, irrigated, non-irrigated, and trying to get a response of stress based on this thermal and multispectral. And also, this links to a tractor that is equipped with a boom and 5 sets of sensors. So what we are trying to do, and drones link this really well, and this is the holy grail in remote sensing, that is, can we link what we measure in the field to what satellites see or to what airplanes see, and then save us a lot of time based on what other people also said. And so drones provide this link between this tractor, which is equipped with NDVI, with a sensor that measures health, vegetation health, measures plant height, and measures temperature, and the drones are acquiring this exactly same type of data. And then we are going to be connecting, linking this to orbital images. So this scaling type of procedure.
I'm not sure a lot of people are aware, but Japan has been using drones for precision agriculture for quite some time now. And one of the advantages of using rotary wing, quad, hex, octocopters, especially with aerial spraying, is that you fly them low enough, the wake tends to flip the leaves around. So they're able to coat both sides of the leaves, not necessarily coat, but they're able to treat both sides of the leaves a bit better than just a random pass across. There's quite a bit of literature been done on this. You certainly can look into that for sure. But again, the other thing that you mentioned was the multispectral, hyperspectral, thermal, different types of imagery sensors. So we're going beyond visual spectrum, RGB cameras, and using these things to help increase yields for the farmers, and in the case of forestry with LiDARs and things. So we're integrating LiDARs at the university right now onto our systems to look at forest stands and look for things, variations and things that you can't see at the resolution at the satellite level. We're able to do much more focused studies. So, next question, yes, go ahead.
You guys mentioned the structure and motion. Can you expand upon the types of software you're using and how you're using that data?
Yeah, so there's a number of software out there, but we're using the Agisoft PhotoScan software.
What is it called?
Agisoft, Agisoft. is the company. It's a Russian company, and the software is called PhotoScan.
Are you using the professional or the standard edition?
We have used both, but we're using the professional. So what we've got, yeah.
Thank you.
So, so if you've taken the same area and you have images taken from different perspectives, essentially it's like reverse photogrammetry. So you're looking at the perspectives to recreate the geometry of the object, or it could be, you can take it with ground photos too. So it could be this table, it could be this room, it could be the building, it could be the landscape. So it's very flexible, and the result is a 3D point cloud, and you can practice with the density of it, and if you have some features that you can get an X, Y, Z coordinate, you're able to scale it and then integrate that into a geographic information system.
Another software, I mean, Pix4D is another company out there that people use often. And I'll just add on to Marguerite's message there is that there's a real art to post-processing imagery. And I speak from experience in the fact that having the software and the Russian flow, instruction sheet translated to English is not necessarily the easiest thing to just put in the info and out comes out your data. There's a real art to learning how to get the calibration information entered and these things. And so, don't expect the first time post-processing to end up with a gorgeous end product. You may have collected the data correctly, but there's a real process involved.
What do you think some of your best practices are? I mean, you mentioned that there's maybe a cultural difference when it comes to the Russian.
Exactly.
What are some of the best American practices?
The best American practices are right now being put on social media. I'll be honest, people are having problems and have created talk groups or forums to answer these questions. I'll be honest, the Agisoft PhotoScan company, the guy who created that is on his forum every night, taking in people's problems and answering questions. And there's actually several people I know who are putting together basically how to use the software, as a publication, if you will. And so there'll be ways to do that. But I know, depending on where you work or whatever, it depends, how your data is stored and how your data end products are, produced and how they can be released varies from institution to institution, and it depends on things. So there's a lot of things that go into it. I mean, that's a great question, and one that's still being worked on is probably the best way to put it.
So Jerry, after that point?
Yeah, and I'm gonna shut up.
No, it's fine.
If anybody would like to see it, I have a laptop here running Agisoft PhotoScan. If anybody would like to see it and talk offline.
Yep.
It's a great program. There's lots of others out there. There's freeware programs out there too. Agisoft has just really become the leader in the initial forms. Pix4D has some advantages, especially in multispectral stuff right now. And again, this is from work that I've done with the EPA and USGS with their MicaSense, for example, the MicaSense Red Edge and other sensors. We've developed workflows to get Agisoft to adapt to that sort of imagery.
Is there an advantage to Agisoft versus Pix4D versus drone?
It depends on who you ask. The answer is it's basically the same photogrammetric concept. The algorithms are a bit different. It really comes down to the processing of power of your computer and a lot of other things regarding the speed and the output and how much you can put in at once. A lot of this stuff, even 3 years ago, the size of an image, 12 megapixel image, now we've got 50 megapixel images, and, a flight might have collected 200 megabytes, and then, a terabyte is not uncommon at the end of the day now. So again, we've got bigger data sets. How do you store these things? How do you archive them? Things that you need to think about as well before you just go out and start flying and collecting lots of pictures.
And just add that Autodesk has a free version. It used to be called 123D Catch, and now it's called Recap for reality capture. So it's kind of in the 3D video world, and so I have my students play around with that with just handheld photographs. It's Recap.
What is it called?
Recap, just
Recap.
RECAP. It's a free download, so it's an online version.
The lady in the blue shirt has been trying really hard.
Yeah, thank you.
It's kind of answered a few of my questions, but one of the questions I wanted to know is, once you collect the data out of the field and you bring it back to the lab and you're on your software, what are some of the obstacles and some of the difficulties you find in your own study when you're processing the data from drones?
Courtney?
I could talk about difficulties. So I work with PhotoScan for all of my data, and I can vouch that there is a large online community that is extremely helpful to get through some of these obstacles. A year ago, I had never heard of this process, and now this is how I analyze all of my data. So it is possible to learn the software fairly easily. The main issue that I run into is processing time, because you are working with a huge amount of data, and so the models can take an inordinate amount of time to build. I usually just leave them on overnight and go to sleep. Sometimes, you have to make sure that your computer has the power to process that much data, because sometimes you'll wake up and everything has frozen, and then that's 8 hours of time that is now wasted. That is really the biggest obstacle that I run into, though. I will say that PhotoScan is great to work with. It's easy to manipulate the models. It's easy to edit them. You can build orthophotos, digital elevation models right in PhotoScan and export them to other GIS programs. There's a number of different file formats that you can export to, so it's really limitless where you can send your data if you're working with other programs after the fact. So I can build an orthophoto and then work with that in ArcMap. I can build a digital elevation model and then export that to Qt Modeler and manipulate that in Qt Modeler. And I really love this software.
Mac or PC?
I work on a PC. I haven't tried any of this on a Mac. Marguerite, do you have experience doing this on a Mac?
Do a boot, I guess. It depends on the software.
Most everyone, the software is primarily, it's written in the Windows language, so you have to convert, at least for PhotoScan. But there are folks who are using Macs on it. But it is so graphically and processor intensive that you probably want to have a computer just dedicated to post-processing. So when I travel, for example, I have a workstation that travels with me and gets plugged in at the hotel and it starts processing. Exactly. It's a Mac. I'm sorry, it's a PC. But I can also, the biggest challenge I have is I can also remote into workstations on campus. The problem is sending those boluses of large data sets over a Wi-Fi signal at, the Best Western isn't always going to be big. No offense to Best Western, but I've been in the middle of nowhere, and that's where I have to stay to get my data in Idaho. And so that's where we found actually bringing, an extra piece of computing equipment has made it a little easier because
How do you get over that hurdle then? Because that's one of the challenges.
It's a huge hurdle, and I'll tell you, it's through experience. I mean, I can tell you physically that I've carried tremendous amount of equipment to go from Florida to Idaho 5 times to go do pygmy rabbit habitat. And we've done things with checking our aircraft with these large crates and, you know, media. I mean, you talk about pelican cases, we look like the Army coming into, I'm not kidding. And you come to these places, you have to rent a vehicle that's big enough to handle all your equipment. And I mean, there's a lot of logistical things that you have to think about before you even set foot in the ground. So again, there's things that need to be thought of, and I spend quite a bit of time going to places that are just starting out with UAS stuff and try and make them aware of some of the pitfalls and things that we've fallen into just through experience, and hopefully you can avoid them as well by learning from our mistakes so that we don't have others doing the same. So, all right, we're getting close. I'll take a few more. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, before asking a question, I would just suggest that for image processing, if you're using GPUs, that would be based. Sorry, because like whenever people in computer science, they are working with neural networks, like with imaging data, they use GPUs, and they are like pretty efficient. And media, I think you can search for series, they are very cheap. Okay, coming back to my question. Okay, we talked about imaging a lot, but then there are like many different things like radiation level or temperature change, or like the amount of emission gases and all that. So how exactly you're using drones for such things?
Yeah, so the question I think actually kind of applies to something we haven't talked much about up here today, and that is air quality and things like that. Anybody have? We recently flew, for example, over prescribed burn with the EPA, and they had a sensor, and we mounted a device that the EPA had actually created to do air quality samples, and our job was to fly through the plumes of smoke and measuring different types of carbon and methane and various types of things. So it's an application, but you also have to consider things like downwash and how far away is the sampler from your flying. I think most of us in here are thinking primarily about electric-powered devices, right? UAS with battery power. Obviously, some of the larger super lift things are using liquid fuel-based things, and so then you also have emissions from your small motors. So you need to think about that sort of thing as well. I think everybody up here is waiting for battery power to catch up with everything else. Smaller, lighter batteries, I can tell you, and that's the thing that's really holding back, because that then would allow us to put more sensors, and you end up with more payload and longer flight times, really.
And I'll just add heat limitations. So we
For sure.
run into, once it gets above 90, and that happens a lot on the coast. I'm sure all of our work has been limited by that. The iPad stops working, the Wi-Fi connection, the batteries are overheating. So you have to bring a cooler to cool everything down, or time your flights, and that has limited us. So.
Oh yeah, working in the middle of the Everglades, there is not a shade tree. And so, yeah, we create our own shade. We bring a battery-powered fan to blow through the fuselage. We keep everything under an umbrella. I've also gone to the other extreme while working on my project in Idaho. -4 Celsius, your batteries behave very differently. An aircraft that was designed to work in the Everglades doesn't work so well at 4,000 meters above sea level. Just because you buy it off the shelf doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work in your specific environment, whether it's humidity, temperature, density of the air, humidity. These things are all things that have to be considered. And again, I can speak from experience. The first flight in Idaho didn't go very far because the density altitude, we just didn't have the right propeller on our fixed wing aircraft. It was just not pulling enough air, and that was a problem. But until you get out there and do it, you're not necessarily going to have it. The stock that comes with your DJI system has a sweet spot somewhere in the world, and that may or may not be where you're doing your work. So again.
I think we also need advances in waterproofing. I know some of in the tropics, during the rainy season in Costa Rica, we're trying to figure out, well, how can we get out to a site, pull a flight off, get back some of these areas we're wanting to access are rather inaccessible, hence the drone. But the humidity can be so high that even when it's not an issue of being caught in the rainstorm, that you want to invest in good equipment, but you want to invest in equipment that's not going to be excruciating when you have water damage.
That is a huge issue, and again, I have a lot of experience dealing with that and can give some advice on how to resolve some of those issues. All right, final question. Let's go back there. Yeah.
Kind of going off this other question about other kinds of sensing. So Snotbot, water sampling, air quality. What are other examples of perhaps non-visual sensing, or where visuals are kind of secondary, that you can share?
Great. So the question is basically, beyond air, land, and water, what are some of the other environmental things that we could consider? I'll let the panel start. Okay.
Pretty visual.
Yeah, they're pretty visual. Okay. Well, I'm sorry to keep answering the questions, but I have experience, again, with this. Certainly, ozone, and again, that falls in the air category technically, but there are a lot of, again, it really comes down to your sensors again, and so there's been a lot of finally miniaturizing a lot of these sensors that traditionally have started in the military. For example, FLIR, when I started working in UAS 10 years ago, the smallest FLIR was, like this, and it cost, $30,000. And I think one of the main things is that the environmental or ecologist natural resource budget is not the DoD budget. And so, we're trying to go out there and use the sensors that we see on TV or in the trade shows, but a lot of those we just can't afford. So finding ways to manipulate existing technologies and things, I think that's one. To get back to your question, volumetric measurements of, mines, Bureau of Reclamation, wants to know how much coal has been taken out. Some of the things that you also were working on, for example, at the University of Florida, is working in GPS-denied environments. So inside caves where, for example, you can't fly. We're doing bridge inspections. Again, that's not necessarily an environmental thing, except if you're studying bats, which we can tell you a lot about guano. But you fly up under these bridges to get good looks and stuff. And again, we're using sensors, both laser and invisible light sensors to avoid making contact with our, the subjects. There are really a long list of other things. I'd be glad to talk to you more about those sorts of things. We're really kind of out of time for this, Sid. I'd like to thank our panelists for talking about some of their things. Certainly find people when you have a free minute to ask more about specifics. And I really appreciate everyone's attention, and thanks again.